Hello and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a director of geopolitical analysis and a partner at Cognitive Investments. Rob's here for our weekly chat. We recorded a day early on Wednesday, September 28th, but this will still come out on Friday morning. I will be on an airplane on my way to my cousin's wedding on Friday, so that's where I will be. Geopolitics has been changing so fast in general that if anything crazy happens in the next 36 hours before we post this, I still think a lot of the stuff that'll be in here will still be relevant, but ask your forgiveness if anything crazy does happen. That's the pace of events right now. So rate, review the podcast if you haven't already. You can write to me at jacob@cognitive.investments to learn more about what we do at CI or with questions, comments, concerns, feedback about the podcast. Otherwise, cheers. Have a great one. See you out there. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor. All right, we're recording a day early. It's Wednesday. Absolutely beautiful day here in New Orleans. Rob, how's it going?
Very good. Very good. How are you doing?
I'm doing okay. I had both my COVID booster shot for Omicron and my flu shot yesterday in both arms. So I'm I'm feeling it. Not that I want to complain too much about it, but I was wondering because we have these mRNA COVID shots right now. And I was wondering why we don't have mRNA flu shots yet, because that seems like a thing. So I was looking online, and apparently Pfizer announced they're in phase 3 trials for these mRNA flu shots. But that could be interesting because the current flu shot's only 40% effective, and sometimes they get the strain completely wrong. I don't know. I think it's worthwhile to just remember how revolutionary the COVID vaccines were and how it might change like aspects of our life. And it also, I think, points to how like the U.S. regulatory agencies are not ready for kind of the stuff that's happening. Like it's good to be safe, but like this mRNA vaccine stuff, does it need like clinical trials that take many, many years? Like they had the design of the COVID shots within a month or two of like having gotten what they needed out of the virus and stuff like that. So I don't know. That's been on my mind. Before we jump in, Rob, I think we should also say or unless, did you want to say something about that?
I was just going to say, on the subject of bureaucratic foot dragging, we might talk about the permitting reform or the death of the permitting reform in the context of the U.S.
Yeah, that's so. And listeners, you can be forgiven if you haven't been tracking this because there's literally been so much crap happening in the world. But Joe Manchin, the nominal Democrat from West Virginia, sort of made one of his key things was that he, in order to sign on to some version of I guess it's not Build Back Better anymore. They're calling it Inflation Reduction Act or something like that. But he wanted this permitting reform that was going to be able to, I guess the idea was to cut a lot of the red tape. So projects that are related to energy, which West Virginia, the coal mining portion of the country, he was hoping that some of that permitting stuff would happen. And it didn't. It basically got jacked out of the bill, the short-term government funding bill on Tuesday. And I don't know. Manchin said that he didn't feel the government should be shut down over politics. That was his line on that. It's kind of hard to argue with that. But getting out of the weeds politically, I think your point, Rob, and we were talking about this before we got on, is that we're just not good at building stuff in the United States anymore. And that's at the micro level to, putting an awning over your side door. I'm not speaking from personal experience at all, to, creating these larger energy projects that are actually going to help the United States move into the future. We're just bad at all of it. And not only are we bad at it, we're not setting ourselves up for success in the way that the government is approaching these things. It all gets bogged down in domestic politics.
Yeah, just to put that into context as well, I just read over the weekend, we were doing some research on this, and there is currently 700 gigawatts of solar capacity now waiting in the planning or permitting stage. So that's projects that are waiting for interconnection to the grid, waiting for permits, waiting for permission. And to put that into context, the total U.S. electricity production capacity is 1,150 gigawatts. So we're talking 65% of the total current amount of production somewhere in the pipeline, but not going through, which is huge.
Yeah, and it is, and it's particularly another thing that I thought was kind of amazing in the short term bill that extended government funding until December 16th. So I assume we'll have another, especially once we see what happens with the midterms, we'll probably have more wailing and gnashing of teeth about keeping the government open. But they approved another $12 billion in emergency cash for Ukraine, which makes a ton of sense. Like, Ukraine is a major foreign policy victory for the United States. Like, for once, the United States is getting what it wants out of a situation, and it really doesn't have to lift a finger. It isn't risking U.S. lives and soldiers. It just has to write some checks and send some what are for us dilapidated and obsolete old weapon systems, but which for the Ukrainians are making all the difference. Like, I'm not poo-pooing the $12 billion to the Ukrainians, but in the bill was also a temporary funding patch that had $1 billion for heating assistance for low-income families in the U.S. and 20 million versus 12 billion to help address the water crisis in Jackson, Mississippi. And I mean, I've got some family on my wife's side in Mississippi, so it gets a little personal, but there's a mismatch there where the United States thinks, oh, we can throw 12 billion at this Ukraine situation, but we're only going to throw 20 million at a U.S. city that didn't have potable water. That there's some disjuncture there, and this has been happening in the United States for a long time, where we're willing to go nation building in Iraq and Afghanistan and all these other things, but at home, like, we're behind when it comes to infrastructure projects. There's the one thing I was hoping for out of the Trump administration was that all of Trump's things about roads and bridges and infrastructure, I was hoping he was actually going to follow through on that. And that was one of the only things he didn't follow through on. So I don't know. There's just a lot there about the United States not being able to keep up from an infrastructure perspective. If I'm playing devil's advocate with myself, the flip side of this is that it's hard for, I think, people like you and me, Rob, who are analytical and just like want progress to proceed on a linear level. Like, let's just make things better over time. And that's not how U.S. history works. Like, it's a boom bust cycle. So we go through these periods where we're complacent and we argue with each other and we don't do anything, and then something happens, and we do a 180 and we go full 100%, 150% on fixing everything. So I'm thinking in particular of like the Sputnik moment in the 1950s and the space race and how much the United States achieved in just a span of a decade. It would be nice if we could like spread that out over time rather than doing that in these big pushes. But that's not the way the economy works. It's not the way markets work.
Well, I guess it gets back to some of our earlier discussions about Europe and how they've felt the crisis at their doors, and it's spurring them to do things that we are not doing here because we don't feel the same sense of urgency.
Yep, that's as good a segue as any. Before we segue to it, though, I just want to say I was thinking, I think of you often, Rob, not in a weird way, but I was thinking particularly of a trip we took, what was that, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, where we were in Miami and we drove across Florida over to Naples to meet some potential clients and friends and contacts and things like that. One of the first times I think we actually spent more than I think it was one of our first times spending time in person together, that drive, wasn't it? Yeah. Which
I think so.
Listeners, if you're looking to learn something about someone, going down to Florida and driving across the state of Florida there's not a lot there. If you really want to get to know someone, that I would highly recommend it for speeding up the getting to know you process. But just to say, Hurricane Ian looks really scary. So if you're listening to this in Florida, I hope you've gotten out of Florida. I hope you're safe. I hope your houses are safe and your infrastructure is safe. As somebody in New Orleans who had to deal with this last year with Ida, I feel it. And I think, unfortunately, we're going to be dealing with this a lot more. And that connects to the U.S. story, too. But anyway, just wanted to shout out those folks and hope it isn't as bad as what it looks like on the news right now.
Speaking of infrastructure, do you want to tell us about pipe sabotage?
Yeah,
what's going on?
Let's do it. I feel like I'm going to let down the listeners again, because last week I said I didn't really understand what the hell was going on inside the Russian strategic mindset. And I have to come back this week and tell you, I have no fucking clue what is going on with these pipelines. Like, none. And not only that, I haven't seen a theory that makes any sense. I don't understand the communication that's coming out of the various European and Russian and U.S. governments on this. It's really kind of baffling. So for listeners who aren't following this super closely, there are these two pipelines, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, that take Russian gas to the European Union. They aren't the only pipelines. There are actually a couple. Turk Stream is another. There's the Yamal pipeline via Poland, and then there's Ukraine pipeline transit. That's where the Europeans get their natural gas from Russia. Nord Stream 2 never actually went into operation. It was this big project that Germany in particular supported to try and increase capacity to import from Russia over time. But Nord Stream 1 was one of the primary ways that Europe imported natural gas from Russia. And for most of this year, even in the context of the war, Nord Stream 1 was actually at sort of the previous year levels until it was a couple months ago when the Russians started saying, oh, we're having problems. We have to fix these pipelines. It's not going to work. And that's slowly devolved into Nord Stream 1 really plummeting to zero exports of natural gas to Europe as of a couple weeks ago. What's happened here in the last week is that in both pipelines, and I don't understand the physics or the geomechanics of it or anything like that, but basically there were explosions or drops in pressure. Something is happening with these pipelines where you're getting holes in them in the pipelines, and you're getting these massive, you've probably seen the pictures out there. If you haven't Googled this, it looks pretty cool, but these massive like whirlpool looking things in the water that shows you the pipeline sort of completely failing. And the upshot is nobody knows who did it. I've seen on Twitter, everybody's posting some braggadocio from Biden a couple months ago, where the United States, where Biden was kind of winking at, oh, like we can shut down Nord Stream 2 if we want to. There was a strange tweet from a former Polish defense minister, I think it was, about thanking the United States for whatever it was doing. There was some, in the initial reporting out of Europe, there was some innuendo that maybe it was the Ukrainians who were behind it. That has sort of gone away, and now it's the Russians are saying this must be a state actor, and the Danes and the Swedes are not willing to point the finger at Russia publicly, but they're also saying this has to be sabotage. And then just to sort of complete the picture, Turkish media reported this morning that the Russians had said that there was somebody tried to attack the Turk Stream pipeline, which is one of the only ones that is actually working right now in terms of getting natural gas from Russia to Europe. So that's what's going on, and I don't have an answer to your question, Rob. I don't quite understand who did this or why they did this. I don't know. Can you think of whose interest it would be in to shut off these pipelines? Because I can't. It doesn't really make sense to me on the face of it.
Well, maybe the more useful way to think about it, rather than speculate around what happened or who was behind it, is to really analyze how is it likely to be interpreted by everyone on either side with their own motivations and points of view. So if you're the EU right now, does this make you more determined to resist Russia? Do you interpret this as, Russian sabotage? Or is it being, is it just a mystery and it doesn't have any noticeable impact? What do you think?
Well, this is where the conspiracy theorists make some hay, because if you take Nord Stream 1 off the table, in some ways you're tying Europe's hands behind its back. So you're basically saying those folks in Europe who might have wanted to find a way to lower sanctions on Russia and get Nord Stream 1 back up to its previous levels, that's not going to happen. So it doesn't matter if you take sanctions off of Russia. It doesn't matter if you make some kind of deal and get Ukraine to calm down with its offensive, this, that, or the other thing. If you take Nord Stream 1 off the table, you can't get enough via the Ukraine transit and Turk Stream to make a huge difference. I mean, it would make a huge difference, obviously, but you're not going to get back to any kind of new normal. So you're sapping even the will of those that would want to negotiate with Russia, because you literally can't get the natural gas from point A to point B. But we've talked about this on this podcast a lot, and it's one of the areas where we've been contrarian since the very beginning. And I haven't seen a softening of European resolve since this conflict started. I see nothing but a strong European resolve not to deal with the Russians. And if anything, what you're getting is from sort of countries like Denmark and Sweden, who have become more militaristic in the past couple months. Sweden's joining NATO. Denmark got rid of a law that prevented it to have defense and security cooperation with the rest of the EU. They're thinking in terms of having to defend their interests and talking about an attack on a pipeline like this as an attack on them, on Europe, and on their national sovereignty. The flip side is, if you look at Russian media this morning, it's sort of, I found Russian media really strange this morning because nobody's taking credit for it. If anything, Russia is sort of putting the blame on various actors without actually naming them. There was one, I think it was in Vetamosti, there was a column where the author was basically like, yep, this is how this conflict is going to be internationalized. So this has gone from a Russia-Ukraine sort of little war to a Russia versus the West war. And this locks the European Union in on the side of the West. We're never going to have good relations with the European Union. So, we've talked for a while about what is the Russian mindset about using natural gas to try and increase its leverage over Europe. I've been uncomfortable with that narrative for a while because I don't think it actually does anything for Russia and it's not working. And I can't believe that the Russian sort of establishment is that they're going to keep doing the same thing over again, expecting different results. But I also don't have an explanation for what else they could be doing. So if that's Russia digging in and trying to put pressure on Europe, we're just going to get to a situation where Europe and Russia aren't going to have good relations. And Europe's not going to import gas from Russia. And they're going to have to go to the nightmare scenario where a complete or a close to complete gas cutoff means they have to turn to nuclear. The Germans are restarting nuclear plants. They're going to have to buy coal from Indonesia. They're going to have to sort of scrape by here in this next winter before they can get to some level of energy security.
And yet, on the same day, I noticed we had on our research platform internally that this Baltic pipeline was just completed, which I knew nothing about. I don't know if you could give the background to this and how it fits into the puzzle.
It wasn't sort of on the front of my mind either. It's been, dear listeners, think of a map. This is a pipeline that is supposed to connect Norway to Poland. And it's something that has been talked about for literally decades. I think 2001 is when your favorite Danish oil and gas company, it was then known as Dong, Rob. I believe they've changed their name since then because they don't want to be known as Dong. They first started talking about this pipeline, and it sort of got shelved for a while because of the economic feasibility, and then it got revived around 2007. Then you get the 2008 financial crisis, so things get a little bit weird in terms of financing for things. But basically, Poland has been wanting to diversify its energy exposure away from Russia for a long time because Poland has never trusted Russia. Poland has been saying for years, you can't trust the Russians. They are coming for us. We need more defense. We need U.S. military bases here. We need the European Union to stand up to the Russians. And the Western European states, namely Germany and France, have always sort of poo-pooed the Poles. They've said, don't worry about this. This is not the 20th century anymore. Like, we have to deal with Russia pragmatically. We can't isolate them. This is the wrong approach. Nord Stream 2 was basically Germany going long on cheap access to Russian gas. They wanted more Russian gas because they thought that they could deal with Russia in the long term. And that was something that multiple French governments supported as well. So this Baltic pipeline coming online, which I think it's going to come online a few months ahead of time. Imagine that, completing something a little bit ahead of time. We're talking about maybe 10 billion cubic meters of annual capacity, which is not a huge amount, but it's something. And that's the sort of situation Europe is in right now. In the sit rep for our clients and readers last week, I sort of mapped out, okay, like I think it's 150 Russian BCM they're going to have to replace. Here are all the jigsaw puzzle of where they're going to have to get it from in the rest of the world. And it's uncomfortable, and it sucks that you have to get it from 10 different places. But in that sense, the Baltic pipeline is also just, okay, here's an answer for where 10 BCM is going to go, and it's specifically 10 BCM to Poland, because that's the other part of the natural gas story. Even though LNG makes gas more easily transportable, it's still really hard for some of these states in the interior of Europe and Central Europe to get the LNG. Spain, for instance, has a bunch of LNG terminals, has the most LNG capacity I shouldn't say a bunch of LNG terminals. Spain has the most LNG capacity to import in the European Union, but it can't actually transmit that to countries like the Czech Republic or Hungary, which are so dependent on pipelines from Russia and on that natural gas. So it tells you something about Poland betting right, sort of in the long term strategically and from geopolitics, and Germany betting wrong. And it will help. How it might be a small amount, but Europe needs all the help it can get. It will help Europe a little bit in scraping together the natural gas it needs to get through the winter and beyond. And I put on our research platform earlier this week. I mean, I'm increasingly interested in what's going on in Poland. This is something that my old boss and partner, George Friedman, this is one of the things he was absolutely dead on. He'd been talking about the role of Poland for decades. And I remember when he first started saying things about Poland being a significant power in Europe, he got laughed at. People didn't take him seriously. They are. And they have been sort of behind the Ukrainians the whole time. They've been right about the Russians the whole time. And now Polish companies are lining up, looking at what's happening in Ukraine, and they want to help rebuild Ukraine, which would be very good for a lot of these Polish industrials and things like that. And considering Polish markets have gotten absolutely clobbered along with everything else, that's an interesting sort of back play if you think Ukraine's going to go continue to push the Russians back. So I rambled a little bit off course, but that's what the Baltic pipeline makes me think. It makes me think Poland bet right, Germany bet wrong. And it's just another sign that Europe's going to find a way to cobble together the gas supply that it needs, I think, to get through the next 8 to 12 months. The more pressing issue for Europe, to the first part of our conversation today, is can they cut the bureaucratic red tape? Can they get the money where it needs to go to invest in all of this, new age energy projects that they're talking about? Because if we get to next summer and they haven't been able to do that, I don't know how many years you can sort of cobble together this kind of thing, and then energy prices are going to be high for a long time, and the advantage of the switch isn't going to happen. So I'm rambling a little bit, but hopefully that answered your question.
Well, just yesterday, President Macron was in Saint-Lazare on the west coast of France, inaugurating a new offshore wind facility, and making the same complaint that this was something that took 11 years to finish before it got through the permitting and environmental review. And he was calling for an acceleration of all of that, and citing all of these issues of national security as being, of paramount importance. Let me ask you, so before Russia-Ukraine, I think it's fair to say that people thought of the EU in sort of three groups. There was the northern group, which were the sort of stern fiscal disciplinarians. There was the southern group, which consisted of Italy and Spain and sort of France as well. And then there was the eastern group of Poland and Hungary and those nations sort of doing their own thing. How has Russia-Ukraine changed that balance of power between Poland, Hungary, and the rest of the EU? Do they have more leverage than before? And if Ukraine is able to remain independent in some form and sort of enter the calculus in a way that they didn't previously, how does that change that balance of power also?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's a good segue into talking about Italy's elections too, but maybe we'll do that on the back end of this. I think the first thing that we can say that it's done is that it has really kneecapped the cooperation between Poland and Hungary, who have been the redheaded stepchildren of the European Union now for years. They have conservative, nationalist-leaning governments. They didn't like immigration. They didn't like Brussels telling them what to do. They felt like all the rules being made in Brussels benefited the stronger powers like Germany and France. It didn't actually take them into account. And Poland and Hungary were the two countries making common cause to kind of push back against that. Poland and Hungary aren't on the same page anymore because Hungary, even more so than Germany, bet long on Putin and bet long on Russia. They thought that you needed pragmatism with Russia and that Russia was going to be a partner and that Hungary was going to do well because it was going to be sort of the European interface with Russia in that sense. They're not on the same page anymore. So you have this schism, I think, in that Eastern European bloc. They're not necessarily on the same page anymore. They are still about Brussels, but they have such differences between them that maybe you don't have that level of unity on opposing some of the things that are coming out of Brussels. The second thing, though, and this gets into sort of the Italian election, which is the Italians just elected this woman. Her last name is Meloni, and I'm forgetting her first name because I haven't had enough coffee yet today. It's Giorgia. I'm sorry, Italians, if I'm mispronouncing that. And she's sort of your classic center-right, I shouldn't say classic center-right politician, but she's very center-right. She's talking about immigration and gender identity and all of these sorts of things. But she's a new breed, I think, of of center-right politician because she wants nothing to do with Russia either. She's actually clashed with her other sort of center-right compatriots in Italy because she wants to go harder on Russia. She doesn't want to take the pressure off the Russians at all, whereas Salvini, who is this other Italian populist leader who thought he was in line for the throne eventually, he didn't want to put as much pressure on Russia anymore. So my point is that if somebody like Meloni is what the center-right and Eurosceptic argument looks like, somebody who wants to stay in the Eurozone but wants to change the terms of the dispersals of the funds coming from Brussels, somebody who doesn't admire Putin at all, if anything, wants a stronger European response and wants each of the individual states to be stronger so it can stand up to somebody like Vladimir Putin, that's quite a change. These aren't even I was about to say, these aren't your parents' Eurosceptics, but it's only 5-10 years ago that we had Eurosceptics. So it's not your teenagers Eurosceptics. I don't know the right way to make that phrase, but you'll help me. But the point is just that the Eurosceptic argument has really gone away. And even in Hungary, the Hungarian government is talking about making compromises so that it can get access to its EU dispersal funds. I'm not sure that sort of level of compromise and reform would be happening if Russia hadn't made this move, which again goes back to what is Russia doing? Like they everything was working their way. They had set the table up perfectly, and they kind of just screwed themselves. To annex some portions of eastern Ukraine that they can't hold? But we don't have to go down that rabbit hole again.
So relative to the consensus, would you be long or short Hungary over the next 5 years, given the way things have played out?
I think, with apologies to our Hungarian friends, that you have to be short Hungary the next couple years. I don't mean that from a markets perspective, but I think this about Germany a little bit as well. If you can get past the current problems, maybe you can get to Churchill's broad sunlit uplands. But there's a long way from point A to point B. And if you're a country that was pretty dependent on Russia for access to cheap energy, and now you no longer have that access, you're looking at higher energy costs for the next couple of years. And in general, cheaper energy is going to be an advantage, especially in sort of the volatile and I think inflationary energy market over the next couple of years. So yeah, I think both Germany and Hungary have some problems that they're going to have to work through. The question is, can Hungary flip that switch, and can it get itself off of dependence on Russia, or can it use its position as sort of being the historical, I don't know what the right word is, but having a better relationship with Russia? Can it use that relationship to maybe still get natural gas from Russia, even as all these things are going on, without pissing off Brussels? I don't know. But just from the standpoint of Hungary is probably going to have some of the highest energy costs within the European Union over the next couple of years, just because they don't have any of the infrastructure to switch quickly. They did make that big bet on Russia going forward, and they don't have national champions like the Germans do, who can pivot quickly to things like nuclear and hydrogen and all these engineering feats that the Germans are famous for. So I don't think the situation is dire for Hungary. Like the European Union is going to try to help them, and they're going to have to accept that help. So maybe in that sense, they'll get more European help. But that's going to be a difficult thing for the Orban government to do after being the leaders of the Eurosceptic camp for as long as they have been.
And just moving a little bit farther east, because I want to ask you about the UK. But before we go there, I'm curious. I noticed that Kazakhstan is having an election, and this new president, Tokayev, I think that's how it's pronounced, Tokayev, is seemingly kind of consolidating his power there. Does that tell us anything about Russia and its own influence in the region? Because traditionally Kazakhstan was always very much under their thumb, if I understand that right.
You're absolutely right. In January, before the Russia-Ukraine war, if we can allow our brains to imagine what the world looked like before the Russia-Ukraine war, there were protests in Kazakhstan, and the Russians sent soldiers to help put the protests down. So it was almost like a Belarus level relationship where the Kazakhs looked to Russia to help instill law and order in the country. What a difference in just in the last couple months in Kazakhstan's seemingly finding a backbone and standing up against Russia. And we talked about this, I can't remember if it was last week or a couple weeks ago, with Xi Jinping being in Kazakhstan on his way to that big summit in Uzbekistan and talking about, in very, very flowery language, the Chinese-Kazakh relationship is one for the ages, blah, blah, blah. The Chinese didn't say that about Russia or anybody else. I mean, it's a big sort of thing for China to think about Kazakhstan. So they have a patron that is waiting there to kind of help them. But it's not just Kazakhstan. I mean, we can go down the list. I mean, Russia's held these sham referendums in portions of eastern Ukraine that they say proves that these regions want to be part of Russia going forward. Kazakhstan and Serbia and Turkey have all come out this week and said, we don't recognize the legitimacy of these referenda, which is incredible. You might expect it from Turkey because they've been sort of ambiguous. They've been trying to sort of see where the wind is blowing and craft their policy accordingly. They also have a lot of dependence on Russian energy and food imports too that they can't. I think they will switch over the next couple of years because of some of the projects that are coming online from the Black Sea, but it's not something they can do over the next 6 to 12 months. But Serbia and Kazakhstan, those are two countries solidly in the Russian camp, and they basically just came out and gave the finger to Russia this week on these referenda. The other thing that we've seen with not just with Kazakhstan, but with places like Serbia, with places like Georgia, Finland, Russians are leaving the country. They don't want to be drafted into this partial mobilization thing. And so one of the places that the Russians who don't want to be drafted are going, they're going to Kazakhstan. I think the increases in migration have been a little overplayed in social media because people were posting old pictures that weren't real of masses of people at the Finnish border, for example. But it's in the tens of hundreds of thousands. The migration patterns are something like 30 to 40% greater than normal. That doesn't maybe tell you anything about Russia itself. It tells you that sort of the people who were most critical of the current Russian government, they're trying to get out, but they're going to places like Kazakhstan and places like Georgia. So you're getting an influx of the people who are probably the most anti-Putin, so much so that they want to get out of Russia right now, flooding a system where there's already that doubt in Russia. So no, I whether it's Kazakhstan, whether it's Georgia and Armenia, whether it's Eastern Europe, whether it's the Balkans, whether it's the Middle East, where the Russians propped up the Assad regime, in Syria, all these places where Russia was fooling around before. The worse this war goes in Ukraine, the longer it goes on, the more you're going to see these defections from countries that were nominally in the Russian camp. And the question is, I think the question really is, do you get defections from within Russia itself? Do parts of Russia like Chechnya or Dagestan or parts in Siberia where there have been such unrest against this mobilization, do they try and break off themselves? The Russians are not going to try to allow it, but they can, those portions of Russia today can look at what Kazakhstan is doing and what Kazakhstan did after the fall of the Soviet Union and say, well, there's a blueprint. Like we want our independence too. So no, I think you're dead on. The last thing I would just say is this goes to show you that you really, and we learned this with Zelensky too, you can't underestimate or know things about an individual politician. Everybody said this to Tokayev. I don't know how to pronounce his name. Everybody said he was sort of a paper pusher, a bureaucrat who didn't have any sort of vision and would definitely continue the Nazarbayev clan's designs and control. He's shown himself to be a very, very savvy political operator in the same way that Zelensky has shown himself to be a very, very brave and effective leader in a war, which you wouldn't think a career in comedy and television would have prepared you for. So just goes to show you not to underestimate individuals and how individuals on these short time horizons can actually really affect geopolitics in major ways.
Speaking of individuals in that part of the world, you mentioned Xi Jinping. What's up with the coup rumors that were flying around this week? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Thank you for teeing me up there so perfectly. I'm going to get on my soapbox here, guys. I don't get up on my soapbox very often, but I'm getting up on my soapbox, in part because I had at least 3 or 4 different people text me at odd hours of the night over this weekend. Y'all know who you are, and please continue to text me with these things. I'm not saying this to throw shade at you. I want you to send me things when they're on your mind. But asking me if there was a coup in China because Xi Jinping had disappeared from view, and there was some unsubstantiated report of Chinese armored personnel carriers rolling down the streets of Beijing. It was this whole thing. And if you actually sort of looked at what was going on, there was no evidence of anything that was happening. It might have been a I don't know who was pushing that narrative, but there was no reason to think that there was anything happening in China that even resembled a coup. If there was a coup in China, either way, like you wouldn't get sort of this piecemeal, it wouldn't dribble out sort of piecemeal. Like a coup to be effective sort of has to happen fast, and you take over the information channels and you get a very sort of clear delineation of what's going to happen next, and none of that was happening. I would also just point out, last year around this time, so ahead of a big policy meeting that everybody talked about in the China watching community, I believe it was Newsweek is the one that's emblazoned in my mind, but they weren't alone. But they were talking about how there was Xi Jinping had a brain hemorrhage and he wasn't going to be able to govern going forward. And the Chinese Communist Party was completely up in arms because they had to figure out who was going to replace Xi Jinping. That wasn't true either. Now we're going into this Chinese Party Congress here in a couple weeks. I think in general, like the reason Xi Jinping has been a little bit quiet is because he's dealing with a real estate crisis. He's going into this major meeting where he's basically, I'm expecting him to formalize or declare what everybody already knows, that he's going to be leader for as long as he wants to be. And I just, it's almost formulaic the way you get these rumors happening around this time every year in China right now. So if you are following an analyst or reading a newspaper or listening to a thought leader who said anything to you about a coup in China over the weekend, you should turn them off right now, because that person was lazy and didn't spend the 15 minutes it took me to understand that 98% chance there wasn't a coup going on in China, despite what some breathless person tweeted on Twitter. Was that good? That was a hot take. I don't know. I don't normally do that.
That was good. Getting a little steamed up here. And with the meeting coming up in a few weeks' time, we've spoken about the housing crisis in China, how this is the biggest story in economics and markets that no one is talking about. Forget about currencies, forget about the Fed, forget about the British pound. This is really the hinge of what's happening over the next few years in the global economy. Should we be looking to this meeting as something that will have tangible effects on the ground in terms of what Xi does or can do, or is it simply symbolic and we should look past it when analyzing what's going to happen here?
It's a little hard for me to answer that question, and I think I recorded a podcast that's coming out on Monday with Neil Townsend where I sort of made this same point. But so I think in some ways, like the entire analytical community has frozen on China because everybody's waiting for this party Congress. So whenever anybody gets asked a question, you just sort of punt on the question and say, oh, well, the party Congress is coming. And then you kind of, you say a couple pithy things and then you kind of go from there. But I do think China's a little bit in a holding pattern. I don't know for a fact that the Chinese Communist Party is sort of holding back all of its things in reserves before the meeting. It doesn't really make sense to me for them to do that. The yuan has been declining a little bit. There have been reports that maybe coming out of the party Congress, you're not going to get a relaxation of these COVID zero policies, but you may get some actual support for the property market itself. But we've been getting support for the property market for a while right now. The problem is that China really just hasn't been able to, as you've pointed out, fix the situation. It's just kind of in this no man's land where it's sort of keeping the situation together, but it's not able to get people to start borrowing at the levels that it was before and keep property prices upwards. So I'm already dancing, you can see there. But I can tell you that a lot of people are saying that there are going to be steps taken to complete stalled housing projects after the leadership gathering. There's going to be more support for the banking sector in general in China. But that's been true for a while now. Like China has been tinkering around the edges, trying to find the right mix of policies that allow them to stabilize the situation without taking out the stimulus 2008 level credit bazooka and move forward. So I don't think it has much to do with the Party Congress itself. That I think has more to do with Xi Jinping just formalizing what everybody already knows. And I mean, he threw some more high profile folks in jail or put them under investigation this week just to remind everyone that the purges are ongoing. But this goes back to why I've been fairly confident that Xi is in control of things, because I think in his brain, he thinks that he needs this level of control in order to push through all these really difficult things that China's going to have to do if it wants to push past this crisis scenario that it's at. And in some ways, I think it's a good thing for China if she, and again, listeners, I'm not saying this from a moral point of view. I'm just saying, sort of objectively, if China wants to achieve some of its goals, you kind of need this sort of figure to make the hard decisions and not brook any dissent. And then you can have a Deng Xiaoping who comes and reforms. The most interesting thing about Xi is that his family was personally affected by Mao Zedong and his helter-skelter approach to this sort of power, authoritarian control. And Xi, again, has also tried to be very precise about that. He wants control and he's purging people, but he's also not, having great famines and cultural revolutions and all these other things. He wants to purge without kind of completely destroying the system. So yeah, did I answer your question? We don't know. Like the thing about these countries with state communist parties like China, like Vietnam, like North Korea, to a certain degree, we don't get a ton of visibility in some ways. We're all sort of literally reading the tea leaves. But all the tea leaves that I see are not that China's going to face a coup or that Xi is going to go anywhere. It's that Xi has consolidated control. He's going to make difficult decisions going forward. He's been making them before the Party Congress. He will make them after the Party Congress. I think it's just the Party Congress is a nice little thing that articles can lead in to take away some uncertainty. I guarantee you, once the Party Congress is over, something else will stand in as the Party Congress in the story making about China.
I think that it sounds intuitively right. And I guess the way that I think about it from a market participant standpoint is I would be much more worried if they were being much more active. And what I mean by that is the fact that they're not doing that much and they're sort of trying to lead the horse to water, as we've said, in a kind of gentle way, suggests to me that he feels very secure. And that's a good thing in the end. It probably means that he's readying to take the medicine, because you only can push through very difficult transitions like this, I think, when you have stability and control. If they were panicking and throwing fiscal stimulus at building another ghost city, I think that would be a sign of weakness rather than strength.
Yeah, and folks, I apologize if you can hear the small yapping dog in the background. That's Maggie. She's incredibly sweet. She's my mother-in-law's ward, and she's here with us right now. No, and Rob, you and I have talked about this for a long time. This is one of the areas where I think the adding geopolitics to the market research is most effective, but also most problematic, because geopolitically, what is good for China here in the long term will be bad for Chinese markets in the short term. Ironically, from sort of the geopolitical long-term macro, whatever word you want to throw in there, perspective, you want some pain in the Chinese economy right now. You want Xi to deliver the message. You want no dissent. You want to make sure that these things sort of get fixed so that going forward, China can do all the things it wants to do: ascend global value chains, have domestic champions, buy Starbucks and iPhones and everything else that U.S. companies want them to buy. So geopolitically, this might be good, but for markets right now, it's bad. And the markets, you've sort of talked about how markets are somewhat forward-looking, but they can't see quite that far ahead. All they see is, zero COVID, and Xi's an authoritarian, and he's talking about Taiwan, and he's buddies with Russia, and the demographics are terrible, and maybe he had a brain hemorrhage, and once we get rid of the brain hemorrhage thing, maybe there's a coup, and then when the coup isn't real, let's go back to the Three Gorges Dam is going to collapse. They keep on trying to find the thing that's going to make the situation go kaboom, and it's not happening. But my point just being that geopolitically, pain right now is good. And I think for markets on a long-term horizon, that will also be good. But the good geopolitical thing that China's doing right now is going to be bad, I think, for China's markets in the short term, especially those parts of the market that are tied to real estate development, those sort of nittier, grittier things, unlike sort of the tech companies, which, earlier this year, we took advantage of the fact that there was a little bit of a relief rally in the tech companies. So I think that's one of the ways that we're different in how we use geopolitics and markets. Like, we don't use geopolitics to say, geopolitics says X, we buy stock Y, or geopolitics says X and we go long this particular country. It's more like, you charge me with understanding the geopolitics, and then you take that back to the team and say, okay, like, here is what's happening. Here's the media narrative around it. How do we express that? And sometimes they'll be the same thing. Sometimes they'll be different things.
Yeah, it's the framework within which you make individual or company-specific decisions in many ways.
Yeah.
Maybe this is a bad comparison, but I think of the comparison between what's happening in China now and sort of the medicine taking. Even though if China had a representative government, I cannot imagine that they would be willing to incur the kind of pain that's necessary to rebalance the economy. And the natural contrast is to what's happening in the UK right now. We talk about this notion of, you know, democratic regimes need price signals to signal like, hey, now it's time to change because the policies are not working. You need a sense of crisis to develop before something big tends to change. And that's an interesting contrast with what's happening in China. Because, they see that there's a major problem, but no one's holding their feet to the fire. They have to recognize that it's a major long-term risk to their own power and deal with it accordingly, which is always very tough.
You're right. And this is one of this gets into I think we've danced around this before on this podcast, but this gets to the democracy authoritarian argument. I remember arguing with Andre, who's been on this podcast before, Andre Sushentsov. Sorry, Andre. And I remember talking with him in Moscow at one point, sort of asking him point blank, I don't understand why you put up with this Putin regime. And, he sort of laughed at me and said, look, like Russia is not the United States. We're a vast country that traverses all this territory. Like our political experiment is different than your political experiment. What happened in North America with the Mississippi River and your bevy of riches and sort of small towns with plantations and things like that just didn't work here. So you have your political experiment and we have ours. And the other flip side of that is, you're exactly right. And we have a perfect example. Like India has over 1 billion people and has a democracy and can't get anything done, and has a GDP per capita that's in line with Haiti, whereas China has an authoritarian government. That really sucks for the Uyghurs and for Taiwan and everybody else who gets caught on the wrong side of it. But it does mean that if the Chinese government wants to do something, it will be able to move it forward in a way that you wouldn't in some of these larger economies. The flip side of that, just speaking from a really cold sort of perspective, is that usually that kills the innovation impulse. And we've seen that too. So in Russia, like, yes, they were able to become this major energy exporter and things like that, but we're seeing what the innovation impulse dying looks like right now in the battlefield with Ukraine. They've known for decades that they have trouble with command and control and air force and getting communication between your land forces and your air forces and things like that. They couldn't fix it. China, sort of a very similar thing. They are rolling out 5G quicker than anybody else in the world, but they can't make the chips that actually make all the 5G applications and Internet of Things applications work right now because they don't have a system that encourages that sort of innovation. So it's really, you can't really have both. You can have the sort of authoritarian regime that can push that major project forward, or you can have the sort of dysfunctional governance that you have in a place like the UK or the United States. But on the flip side, it creates an environment where people innovate, where people feel where people are maybe more resilient and willing to support a way of life, even if politics and governance is sort of falling short. Now, there are limits to that. Like we've obviously had moments in U.S. history, and there have been moments in British history where the governance is so bad where something has to change. And Britain is certainly flirting with that right now. But that sort of goes into keeping your head level and cold when thinking about politics and its interaction with markets. Because if you just look at China and see Xi, authoritarian butcher, the way Biden talks about him, you're going to kind of miss, you're not going to really understand what's going on in China, and you're not going to make the right decisions with markets, certainly, because you've got blinders on at that point.
Just to play devil's advocate with myself and with you, I'm just thinking, you could make the counter argument also, however, that sometimes even though we bitch about, we're not building anything and all this red tape and there's no sense of urgency and the infrastructure is terrible and all these sorts of things, and look at China, they can build a whole 5G network and ultra high frequency transmission lines across the whole country in 6 months, and isn't that amazing? But at the same time, like, without that market discipline, without the the mechanism of price and market price to tell you something, sometimes those regimes make huge mistakes. I mean, almost always they do. Like almost every, I mean, the reason China's in this pickle, so to speak, is because they did not have functioning market prices to say, hey, you shouldn't continue to plow investment into these areas because it's not creating value. But I guess the opposing argument would be like sometimes they do make big mistakes, and I'm thinking of like Romania in the 1980s, for example. Like Romania had a lot of debt in the 1980s, and what was the dictator's name? Ceausescu. I'm totally butchering that. Ceausescu.
I forget what he called himself. The genius of the Balkans or the Carpathians. I forget. He was a lunatic.
He was a lunatic, but he decided in the 80s, I remember the story, that they had to pay back their debt. Like this was a big thing, and he implemented just enormously stringent fiscal measures and clamped down the whole country for a decade. It was miserable in Romania. They had a terrible, terrible decade-long recession because they were just determined to, clamp down on spending, draw down their debt. And then the irony was, like, at the end of the decade, they didn't ultimately have to do any of that because all the other Soviet republics who didn't do that, they just inflated away their debt, and it was all over. So they had incurred that for nothing. So anyway, it's just...
No, I appreciate your devil's advocacy, and you're literally in some ways advocating for the devil in this sense, because we're watching an authoritarian government make exactly that sort of regime-crushing mistake. That's what Putin's invasion of Ukraine is. He played everything perfectly, not perfectly, but he played his hand extremely well for years and years and years, and he made one mistake, and the whole regime is at risk. The United States or countries like or the United Kingdom can make mistake after mistake after mistake, and okay, so you get rid of the one guy and you put the other guy or the other woman in, and you kind of move forward from there. China has not, like the property sector thing is not a mistake. If anything, China's done a good job at very carefully managing market forces and letting market forces slowly work their way into the Chinese system without sort of ruining the system that was there before. But to your point, the biggest danger, aside from Xi Jinping actually having a brain hemorrhage or getting hit by a bus, is Xi making exactly that sort of mistake. And we can look to Chinese history for exactly what that mistake looks like. The Great Leap Forward, which was Mao's campaign to basically reconstruct China and turn it from an agrarian economy into this communist society, forward-looking, full of technology, formed with people's communes. One of the key things that he wanted to do was multiply grain yields. He kept on asking his provincial officials, what are the grain yields? I want to make sure that we're food self-sufficient and things like that. And nobody was brave enough to tell Mao that the yield sucked, because if you didn't give Mao what he wanted, you were going to find yourself in jail or your head cut off or whatever. I don't know what Mao's chosen way of executing his rivals was. I'm sure he had something that he wanted, but the upshot was Mao realized too late that his policies had created a massive famine where something between like 20 and 50 million people died, and he had a second act as a ruler. But he could have very easily fallen, and China could have very easily fallen apart because he made that sort of mistake. It's why Xi Jinping is such an interesting figure, and why it is so important to see what's happening on the local level in places like China. One of the reasons you and I stopped in our tracks with the China real estate crisis was because it looked like local level banks were not lending. They weren't listening to the central government. The moment you get the breakdown between the locals and the central government in China, it's a sign that, okay, maybe the leader is making a mistake, or maybe the sort of the way the system is working is not actually working, because you're getting people saying one thing or the other. The flip side of that is it's extremely healthy in China for a bank to tell the leader of China to say, no, I don't want to be caught holding the bag. Figure somebody else who should hold the bag, because that's not the way things work anymore. I don't want the non-performing loans on my balance sheet. Like, that's an incredible, that's progress from China's point of view, even if they are sort of trying to ease their way out of a Ponzi scheme of a real estate sector. So, but yeah, I take your point there. Like, it's China's always just one Xi waking up on the wrong side of the bed from a major mistake away from the whole system kind of going up in flames. Whereas in the United States and the UK, we have more resilience because of the the representation in the government. It's, people we choose and we can move people in and out. We're running up on time, but maybe that's a good place to leave it, Rob, because I want to do a little bit more research on the pound. And I think we should come back here in a week and pick up this conversation and talk about the UK, because for everything we just said, the UK is a democratic regime that is in danger, I think, of losing that legitimacy. I don't know what the United Kingdom looks like here in 5 to 10 years, and I'm getting increasingly more sort of pessimistic. I was joking to you we should short the pound a couple days ago or weeks ago because I thought we had a little more time. And this, I think, is it's a sort of a more isolated thing with U.S. interest rates and the economy right now. But the UK is fumbling away some of that resilience in the way that there is that incompetence at the top level, in part because the will of the people in parts of the country is not being respected. Scotland didn't want to leave the EU. Northern Ireland didn't want to leave the EU. You're getting these breakdowns in the government is not actually representing what the majority of people in their communities feel like it should be.
Well, assuming the UK is still around next week, we will keep people on tenterhooks and get into that in more detail then.
Sounds good. I'm not sure if this will come out Thursday or Friday, folks, but we hope you have enjoyed, and we will see you next week. And look out for a great conversation with Neil Townsend coming out on Monday. It's a really good one on global food prices. It's one I was really happy with. So, Rob, good to see you, man. Cheers.
See ya.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur.